Afternoon, everybody. Now, what we're talking about today is the Battle of Kursk. It began on July the 5th, 1943. Now, the whole point of this particular battle was after the horrible loss at Stalingrad by the Germans in 1942 and the loss of their largest army in the German 6th Army, the Germans really didn't have control of what was happening on the Eastern Front anymore. And this was Hitler's belief, doing a major push in the area of Kursk would be able to regain the initiative for the Germans and hopefully possibly win the war for them. This is like Germany had enough for one last big push, and this was pretty much going to be it. And so this would be known as the largest tank battle in history. Some of the tanks that brought to bear was, these weren't invented just before the battle, they came out shortly before. Like they brought out the Tiger 1 tank, Germans did. They brought out the Panther tank, and they brought out the Porsche Elephant tank. Yes, you heard that right, Porsche, same guy. Now, the Tiger tank was heavily armored, and it had, I'm doing this really brief, there's a lot more to it, of course. The Tiger tank had a lot of very thick armor, and it had an 88mm gun on the top. Basically, that could pulverize pretty much anything. Now, the Panther, what it has a little bit different, it had a 75mm gun, and it was a little more maneuverable than the Tiger was. So those were brought out to the Battle of Kursk. Now, we'll get the Elephant in a second. What was mostly facing them were the Soviet T-34s in the Red Army. Those tanks, they were a good all-around tank. They had the wider tank treads on them so they can go over the marshy grounds in Soviet Union, and they were mass producing them all across the country, so replacing them and finding replacement parts was never a big problem. Whereas for Germans, they didn't have many replacement parts at all. They were having to make everything back at home or else under slave labor, and a lot of times they didn't have replacement parts, where a lot of times, even from the very, very beginning of the German invasion in 1941, they were having to literally cannibalize other damaged tanks in order to be able to fix certain tanks that they were working on. The German mechanics, it's amazing what they were able to do with such little resources. And so, but with the T-34, it knew it was outgunned and outmatched. It could not take the Panthers or the Tigers toe-to-toe. So what it would do is it would do a bunch of flanking maneuvers, hitting it from the side to where it neutralized the effectiveness of those big guns, and they'd hit them from the side and take out the tank treads and make it easier to beat them. So there was still a high ratio of Soviet tanks that were lost, but going this way, using their creativity and maneuverability with the T-34s, they were able to get around the quote-unquote superior abilities of the Panthers and the Tigers. Now we get to the Elephant tank. What's interesting about the Elephant tank was that, I mean, the gun on the thing was huge. I forgot how big it is, but I know it's pretty huge. And it was called a tank killer. Like it recorded, I mean, only 90 of them were made total during the war. And they reported at the end of the Battle of Kursk, they took out many Red Army tanks. But the thing is, the designers didn't plan for was designers didn't put side guns on the tanks. And plus the tanks were moving very slow. It was a monster tank. It moved at a whopping 19 miles an hour, and it ran so loud that you can honestly hear it 5 miles away. And that drew enemy artillery fire, so the infantry is not going to march next to the Elephant tanks, which means that the flanks of the tank are unprotected. Now here comes to an interesting part that the Red Army did, and I can't wrap my mind around this one, but it's what the Red Army did, and it worked. In the areas that the Germans had already taken, there were elements of the Red Army who were staying hidden. Germans didn't even know they were there. And the Germans would go forward to the next area of the attack a couple miles ahead, and out of nowhere, fresh Red Army units would appear in their rear and be attacking them in the back. So what they'd have to do is they'd have to bring the tanks back and bring the grenadiers back and go back and forth more than once, a couple times in a day, to deal with these new threats in the rear that they were having to deal with all across the front. And by the end of the day, the tanks were out of fuel and the grenadiers were exhausted. So that's one creative way they thought of how to outmaneuver the the Wehrmacht on that. Now, another way the Porsche tank was in the fact that there was no infantry support around it. It had no guns on the side. In some instances, some people say the numbers on this are exaggerated, but in some instances, the Red Army troops would wait for that monster to come rumbling by, run up behind it, throw a Molotov cocktail in its exhaust, and watch as the thing exploded. Some say it was that case. Others say is that because of the tank treads, the anti-tank mines took out a lot of them. So either way, it's like, so the Red Army had to use their creativity quite a bit. So we'll go into that a little more on that one. Thanks.